Christ is risen. Christ is risen. Christ is risen. Some of you know that here at the Riverside Church, we've been experimenting of late with online engagement. You may have noticed, in fact, a small change in our web presence this week. Anybody? New website. One thing we've been using a lot around here is podcasts, our very own subway liturgy, sermons and worship, interviews with folks who are running for lay leadership this year. This new turn of events has gotten me using the podcast app on my phone and discovering some really favorite podcasts. This week, in fact, I was listening to an episode of Radiolab, and I learned this interesting fact. In America and Great Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a little-known but thriving community of professionals known as the Resurrectionists. With the advent of modern medical schools, the study of human anatomy and medicine required actual human bodies for dissection and study, but it seems like nobody was interested in donating their body to science back then. So what's a medical school going to do? Without a steady supply of study material, the thriving schools had to turn to black market professionals, grave robbers, the resurrectionists, who would seek out newly buried bodies, steal them, and sell them to medical schools for profit. This happened a lot, scholars said. And you can imagine the public outcry. People were rightly concerned that they would grieve the death of a loved one, attend services at which the body of their loved one was buried, only to return to the grave the next day and find an empty hole in the ground. It's shocking, this industry built on disregard for the final resting places of the dead. But what I found even more notable as I heard about the resurrectionists is the length to which people went to keep their dead loved ones in the grave. Poorer families would set elaborate booby traps that would go off if the grave was tampered with. Iron fences with big locks were installed around many burial grounds as deterrents to the resurrectionists. And yet another industry emerged, the manufacture and sale of burglar-proof grave vaults made of steel, sold with the promise to you that your loved one's remains will stay in the ground forever. You can't blame them, really. After all of us, we're surrounded by the reality of death. We're mesmerized by the eventuality and the finality of the end of life. It's so commonplace to us, so inevitable, that we often find ourselves just living into its expectation. We need the dead to stay dead. The grave to be just as we expect to find it the next day. But because we're so locked in by this fear, we soon find that it's a fear of death that begins to define our very way of living. Even just this week, we've been hearing stories of denial and death, political intrigue, dear friends betraying each other, the building of a huge monument to power and exclusion, executions planned over the dinner table, the powerful resorting to violence to remind the world that they can cause death, and they will if it gets them what they want. And that was just the news from Washington this week. The story of Holy Week, the last week of Jesus' life, and the story of Holy Week 2017 share this one stark truth. You and I, we are sucked in by violence. We're hypnotized by terror, manipulated by fear, mesmerized by death. We can't seem to give it up, to let go of the constant, cyclical grinding of the human reality. Fear, violence, death. Fear, violence, death. Fear, violence, death. But today is Easter. And if the constant cyclical decay of our human life narrates our living on other days, today it must not. Because today is about resurrection. Today we think about life and all the possibilities that begin to emerge for us when we make a choice that is a matter of life and death. A choice to reject the narrative of fear and choose instead to claim for ourselves and for our world a new narrative. One that does not keep us chained in steel coffins, allowing the fear of death to rule our lives, but opens us up instead to faith, to resurrection. Now, all of the gospel writers include some version of the resurrection story in their memoirs, and we Easter church attenders have heard them all over the years. Today we've been given Matthew's reflections. It had been a harrowing week, filled with fear. All of Jesus' friends had gathered around the table for Passover only 1 week before, and the events of the intervening days seemed numbingly unending and punctuated with pain. First, Jesus was betrayed by his dear friend, turned over to the authorities because he wanted the money. But we all know it was really because of fear. Then Jesus was dragged before a sycophant governor, Pilate, who was too concerned with his own reputation, with staying out of trouble, with making Jerusalem great again, that he washed his hands, quite literally, of the horror around him and gave in to arrogance, which is really, as we all know, fear. Then Jesus' friends watched him beaten, dragged up a hill, crucified, killed. One by one, they fell away. Too worried about their own safety, too concerned about their political positions, too mesmerized with death themselves, which was, as we all know, fear. Fear. And that night the women, they stayed. They stayed as the darkness settled and Joseph of Arimathea came and took Jesus' body down. They were even there, Matthew tells us, when Jesus' lifeless body was placed in the tomb and a huge rock rolled across the entrance just to keep the dead dead. Roman guards were stationed there to make sure no one stole the body, and the women turned to leave. You might imagine their shoulders were sagging with the weight of everything they had seen and heard, all of the hopelessness, all of the horror that made them weep. Weep with pain and despair of the loudest lament of any human ever heard, which rose out of them, as we know, because of fear. All of them, kept prisoner by so much fear. And as the darkness got darker that night, it seemed that all life had to offer was death and endings, over and over and over and over again. But you heard the story. The next morning, 2 of them made their way back to the tomb. They came across a gleaming angel sitting on a rock, 2 guards almost literally scared to death, and an invitation to take a step toward an empty tomb that represented new life. And they were greeted with the words, "Do not be afraid." In that moment, they had a choice to make. Would they choose fear, as so many other times they had? Or would they choose faith? Would they remember that love always has the final word? It wasn't just an afterthought that day, the invitation to choose. It was, in fact, a matter of life and death. If you come to the tombs of your life thinking you're going to find death, that's one thing. But if you come hoping to find the risen Lord, that's another thing altogether. Maybe, just maybe, these women had taken Jesus at his word. Maybe they'd come not to give Jesus a proper burial, but to get a front row seat at his resurrection. And if that was true, they were not disappointed. What would happen to us if we made a choice like the women at the tomb that day? What if we refused to give into a narrative of fear? It would be so very hard because we're people who live in a rational world where grief colors our human experiences, where failure and endings punctuate our lives, where death is a harsh reality, where in fact we are so trapped by fear, we'll do anything to keep things just as we expect. The people in this story who were tripped up by fear, locked in by death, had placed their bets on a world they thought they'd mastered, a world of political power, or military might, or religious privilege or authority, all fueled by large sums of money. But Easter made it obvious that none of these visible sources of power had been enough to keep Jesus dead and buried, their world within their control. They couldn't foil the divine resurrectionist. They couldn't keep a dead person in the ground no matter how hard they tried, and neither can we. In a world full of fake news, it's about time for some good news. And here it is. We have a choice. When we look around us, we are mesmerized by death, determined to keep things just as they are because we're afraid. But on Easter, we stop looking into the hypnotic gaze of fear and consider the possibility of choosing faith instead. We have a choice. And we have to choose faith because it gives our religion hands and feet in a world that so desperately needs the healing love of the gospel message. When we choose fear, our religion becomes impotent. We are dusty, people of dusty books and antiquated sayings and wishful thinking. We have to choose faith because people we have loved deeply have died. But sometimes when death takes them, it also robs us of a life lived with intention. Immobilized by fear, we spend our time hanging on to fading memories and wishing for what was or what could have been. We have to choose faith because living within the structures of this world that paint bleak futures for young men of color and welcome violence against women and kill our precious planet 1 degree of the thermometer at a time. These structures dry our spirits and shrivel our hearts. We throw our hands up in fear and desperation, and we turn against each other because there seems to be no other way. We must choose faith because the mother of all bombs is detonated in our name. And the people in the Sudan are dying of hunger, and children in Flint, Michigan don't have clean water, and the weight of the world lies heavy on our shoulders, and we can't seem to be free of it. We have to choose faith, because like the fear-filled characters in Matthew's resurrection story, nothing that you or I have mastered, political power, military might, religious privilege, authority, large sums of money, none of those things will deliver us from the fear of death that goes beyond everything that you and I can control. It's a good thing then that today is Easter, and today we're not talking about death. Instead, we're here to proclaim life, resurrection, and to make a choice. Will we live our lives choosing the way of fear that leads to death? Or will we step with courage toward the tombs of our lives with faith that God has another way for us? It's our choice today, and it's a critical choice. As the women left the tomb that day, they ran straight into Jesus. He told them to go out, tell the message, tell it boldly. And he said again, don't be afraid. Maybe he also said, your choice is a matter of life and death. Amen.